I'll never forget that night. I don't think I could, even if I wanted to. It started off as a normal sleepover, just two best friends hanging out at Luke's place, playing video games and talking about random stuff. His house was old, like really old, with those creaky wooden floors and tall ceilings that make everything echo. Luke always joked that it was haunted, but I never paid much attention. That night, though, things took a turn. It was around midnight, and we had just finished watching a horror movie, just to get into the spirit of things. We were lying on the floor in our sleeping bags, lights off, just the soft glow of the TV flickering in the background. Luke's parents were out of town, so it was just us. We were talking about school, girls, whatever came to mind when I heard it. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, or maybe the house settling, like old houses do. But then I realized it wasn't stopping. "Did you hear that?" I asked, sitting up. Luke looked at me like I was crazy. "Hear what?" "Shh," I said, straining to listen. It was faint, barely there, but I swear I heard whispering like someone was talking right next to me. But there was no one else in the room. Luke finally heard it too. His eyes went wide. "What the—" We both sat there, frozen, listening to the walls. The whispering got louder, more distinct. I could make out words, but they were jumbled, like someone was talking through a bad connection. I remember feeling this deep, gut-wrenching fear, like something was terribly wrong. "Maybe it's the wind," Luke suggested, but I could tell he didn't believe it. The whispers were coming from inside the walls, not outside. There was no wind in the room, and it wasn't like the sound was drifting in through a window. It was like the walls themselves were talking. We both scrambled to our feet, grabbing flashlights. The room suddenly felt a lot colder, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. We started pacing around, trying to figure out where the sound was coming from. It didn't seem to have a specific source, it was just everywhere. "Dude, this is freaky," Luke muttered, his voice shaking. "No kidding," I replied. I was trying to keep it together, but inside I was freaking out. My mind was racing, trying to come up with some logical explanation, but nothing made sense. Then something clicked. I remembered Luke mentioning something about the house's history when we first became friends. It used to be something else before it became a regular home. But what was it? I couldn't remember exactly. "Luke," I said slowly, trying to piece it together, "didn't you say something about this place having some weird history?" He nodded. "Yeah, my dad mentioned it once. This house was part of a mental institution, like a long time ago. They converted it into a regular home when the place shut down." A chill ran down my spine. Suddenly the whispers seemed more than just creepy sounds. What if they were connected to the house's past? What if we weren't alone? We decided to investigate further, as stupid as that sounds now. We started knocking on the walls, listening for anything that might explain the noise. When we got to the far corner of the room, the whispering stopped. Dead silence. But as soon as we moved away, it started up again. "What the—" Luke whispered. "Hold on," I said, stepping closer to the wall. It was then that I noticed something I hadn't seen before. There was a small, almost invisible seam running vertically along the wall, like a hidden door or panel. "Help me with this," I said, and we both started pushing on the wall. It didn't budge at first, but then, with a loud creak, it slowly swung open. Inside was a dark, narrow space, barely wide enough to fit a person. It looked like an old service tunnel, maybe something left over from when the house was part of the institution. We shined our flashlights inside, and that's when we saw it. An old, rusted intercom system, wires hanging loosely from the walls. It looked like it hadn't been used in decades, but somehow it was still working. The whispers were coming from the speaker, garbled and distorted, but unmistakable. Luke and I stared at each other, our faces pale. "This is messed up," he finally said. "How is this even possible?" I had no answers, so there we were, just exploring the house, when, suddenly, we stumbled upon this weird, almost hidden door. It was like tucked away in a dark corner, barely noticeable. We couldn't believe our eyes. Who would have thought there'd be a secret door in that old house? As we ventured further, we came across an old intercom system. It looked ancient, like something out of a different era. We were curious, of course. I mean, who wouldn't be? We decided to give it a try, just to see if it still worked. And well, let's just say, What we heard next sent chills down our spines. I'll never forget the night at Ember's house. It was supposed to be a typical sleepover, pizza, movies, and gossiping until we passed out. But things took a turn none of us could have imagined. We were a group of 5 girls: me, Emily, Ember, Sarah, Grace, and Chloe. Ember had this cozy guest room with 2 beds, one for her and another for 2 of us to share. The rest would crash on the floor with sleeping bags. We were excited, giddy even, and the evening started just like any other. We all crowded onto the bed with bowls of popcorn, watching some cheesy horror movie that wasn't really scary. It was just an excuse to scream and laugh together. Around midnight, the vibe started to shift. Maybe it was because the movie was over and the house was too quiet. Or maybe it was just that late-night paranoia setting in. Ember's parents were not home, so it was just us and her younger brother, who was already fast asleep upstairs. Chloe, always the adventurous one, decided she wanted to tell ghost stories. We all agreed, trying to outdo each other with the creepiest tales we could think of. We sat in a circle on the floor, the dim light from a single bedside lamp casting shadows on the walls. I could tell some of the girls were getting genuinely scared, especially Sarah, who kept glancing around nervously. After a while, we decided to call it a night. Grace and I claimed the bed near the window, while Ember and Chloe took the one by the door. Emily and Sarah unrolled their sleeping bags on the floor. As we settled in, I noticed Ember's bed seemed a bit off. The mattress wasn't lying flat like it should. It was slightly elevated at one end, like something was underneath it. "Hey, Ember, your bed looks weird," I said, trying to sound casual, though I could feel my pulse quickening. Ember frowned and sat up. "What do you mean? It's like higher at the end," I pointed. Chloe laughed, assuming I was just messing around. "Yeah, right. Nice try. You're just trying to freak us out after those stories." "No, seriously, look," I insisted, feeling a knot form in my stomach. Grace leaned over, her eyes narrowing as she inspected the bed. "She's right. It does look weird." Ember hesitated, then threw off the covers, revealing the bare mattress. The elevation was more noticeable now. She reached down to lift the mattress, and that's when I saw it. A hand, pale and bony, clutching the bed frame. My breath caught in my throat, and for a second, none of us moved. The room seemed to shrink, the air thick with fear. Then, with a sudden panicked shriek, Ember yanked the mattress away, and there he was, a man scrunched up in the tight space, staring up at us with wide, crazed eyes. He had dirt-streaked clothes and greasy hair, and his expression was a twisted mix of surprise and anger. For a split second we were all frozen, disbelief paralyzing us. Then the room exploded into chaos. Ember screamed louder than I'd ever heard anyone scream before, a raw primal sound that tore through the air. Grace bolted for the door, but in her panic she stumbled, crashing into Emily, who was already halfway up, eyes wide with terror. Sarah just stood there shaking, her hands covering her mouth, too scared to move. But it was Chloe who reacted first, grabbing the nearest object, a heavy ceramic lamp, and hurling it at the man. The lamp shattered against the bed frame, missing him by inches, but it jolted him into action. He scrambled out from under the bed, moving faster than I thought possible, and lunged toward the door. I don't know how, but Ember managed to grab her phone and call 911, her voice shaking as she gave the dispatcher our address. Meanwhile, the man was halfway out of the room, but Chloe, brave or just reckless, tackled him, knocking him off balance. He hit the floor hard, and that's when we heard footsteps pounding up the stairs, Ember's brother, woken by the noise. The next few minutes were a blur. Ember's brother, barely 14, tried to help Chloe keep the man pinned down, while the rest of us stood back, too terrified to do anything. The man was thrashing, snarling like an animal, his limbs flailing as he tried to get free. I remember the sound of the police sirens in the distance, getting closer and closer. Finally, the door burst open and 2 officers stormed in, pulling the man away from Chloe and her brother. He was cuffed, struggling the whole time, but they managed to drag him out of the room. The relief was overwhelming, but the fear didn't leave. It clung to the walls, to the bed, to the very air we were breathing. Later, we found out that the man had broken into the house earlier that day, hiding under the bed, waiting for God knows what. He had a record, burglary, assault, but this time he was caught before anything worse could happen. We didn't sleep for the rest of the night. We couldn't. We just sat in the living room, the TV on low, not really watching, just trying to stay awake to make sure it was really over. It's been years since that night, but I still check under the bed every time I go to sleep, because sometimes the things you fear aren't just stories. They're real, and they can be hiding in the last place you'd ever expect. As the night grew darker, a chilling realization hit us. There was someone under the bed. We could hear the faintest of breaths, the rustling of fabric. Our hearts pounded in unison, a silent scream trapped in our throats. Who was it? And why were they hiding there? In an instant, chaos erupted. The room filled with frantic whispers and hurried movements. We scrambled to the door, tripping over each other in our desperate bid to escape. Panic had taken hold, and rational thought was a distant memory. We just knew we had to get out, now. Moments later, the police arrived. Their presence brought a semblance of order, but the fear lingered. They searched the room methodically, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Under the bed, they found him. A man, disheveled and wild-eyed, muttering incoherently. It was a sight none of us would ever forget. The aftermath was a blur of questions and statements. The man was taken away, and we were left to piece together what had happened. Sleep was a distant thought. The night had left an indelible mark on our minds. We knew one thing for sure. Sleepovers would never be the same again. I'm not really into ghost stories or any of that spooky crap, but this was real, and it still freaks me out when I think about it. So it was Mason's birthday, and he invited us over for a sleepover. Us being me, Mason, Kevin, and Josh. A tight-knit group of friends since middle school. It was a chilly autumn night, the kind where the wind howls through the trees and you're constantly checking over your shoulder. Mason's house was your typical two-story suburban deal. Nothing out of the ordinary, just a regular home with his parents away for the weekend. We were in Mason's room upstairs. The night had started out normally. Pizza, video games, and a bunch of dumb horror flicks. We were just winding down, having a good time. Mason's room was cozy, but the cold wind outside was making the window rattle. We'd closed it to keep out the chill, but that didn't stop the cold air from sneaking in through the gaps. Around midnight, things took a turn. We were all lounging around, Josh scrolling through his phone, Kevin sprawled on a sleeping bag, Mason and I playing some game on his console. When suddenly, there was a loud thud on the window. It sounded like someone had thrown a stone at it. The sound made us all freeze. "What was that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Mason, trying to play it cool, said, "Probably just a stray rock or something." But the way the window shook made it clear it was more than that. We didn't do anything at first, but the knocking came again. Louder this time, like someone was banging on the glass. It was a chilling sound, cutting through the quiet night. Mason, braver or dumber than the rest of us, decided to investigate. "All right, let's see what's going on," he said, getting up and walking over to the window. We all watched, a mix of curiosity and dread. Mason pulled the curtain aside, opened the window, and peered out into the darkness. But all he could see was swirling leaves and shadows in the wind. Just as he was about to turn away, there was another thud, and then a sharp, rattling bang. Mason's hand was on the window latch when something happened that I can't shake from my memory. A shadow moved quickly outside, and then, out of the blackness beneath the window, a hand shot up and grabbed Mason by the collar. The hand yanked him hard, pulling him toward the window. Mason's scream was cut short as he was dragged halfway out. He flailed, trying to hold onto the window frame, but he was being pulled with such force. In that instant, we could see nothing. Nothing more than a dark shape beneath the window. Whoever was outside was hidden in the darkness, and with the wind howling and the light from the room barely reaching outside, we couldn't make out any details. Kevin and I lunged forward, grabbing Mason's legs and pulling him back with every ounce of strength we had. Josh was already on the phone with the cops, his voice shaking as he tried to explain what was happening. Mason's face was pale, his eyes wide with terror as he fought against the force pulling him. It felt like forever before we finally managed to drag Mason back inside. He fell onto the floor, gasping for breath, his face a mix of fear and confusion. His shirt was torn and there were deep red marks around his neck where the hand had clutched him. "What was that?" Kevin shouted, backing away from the window. Mason tried to catch his breath, still in shock. "I don't know," he said, his voice barely a whisper. It was a hand, but it was cold, cold like death. We backed away from the window, adrenaline pumping through our veins. I slammed the window shut and locked it, my hands shaking. We huddled together, our eyes darting around the room, jumping at every creak and groan of the house. Just then, Josh peered out from behind the curtain and gasped. "Guys, look," he said, pointing. We all moved to the window and saw two men running across the yard, their silhouettes barely visible in the dim light. They were sprinting away from the house, disappearing into the darkness. The police arrived shortly after, and they found footprints leading to the house and a ladder that had been used to climb up to the second story. The ladder was just found discarded in the yard. It was Mason's. They suggested it might have been local troublemakers, but none of us believed that. The way Mason had been grabbed, it felt too deliberate, too wrong. The rest of the night, we just huddled in Mason's room, lights on, too scared to sleep. We barely spoke, each of us trying to process the fear. Mason's parents decided to move shortly after that night. We never talked about it again, each of us trying to forget the terror of that night. As the clock struck midnight, the air grew colder, and an eerie silence fell over the house. Suddenly, a faint scratching sound echoed through the hallway. It was coming from the old wooden door at the end. With trembling hands, John reached for the doorknob, his heart pounding in his chest. As he slowly opened the door, he saw it, a disembodied hand crawling towards him. The hand seemed almost alive, moving with a purpose. John took a step back, his breath quickening. What could this mean? Why was this hand here? The questions swirled in his mind, but there were no answers. Only the chilling sight of the hand, inching closer and closer. As the night grew darker, the tension in the air became almost palpable. Every shadow seemed to move with a life of its own. Our protagonist, heart pounding, faced the unseen terror with a mix of fear and determination. The struggle was fierce, each moment stretching into an eternity. Would they emerge victorious, or would the darkness claim another victim? The silence that followed was deafening. The once chaotic scene now lay eerily still. Our protagonist, battered and bruised, surveyed the aftermath. The cost of survival was heavy, but there was a glimmer of hope. In the quiet, they could almost hear the whispers of those who had come before, urging them to move forward, to not give up. Just as dawn began to break, the distant wail of sirens pierced the morning stillness. The police arrived, their presence a mix of relief and formality. Questions were asked, statements taken, but the true horror of the night was something that words could scarcely capture. The authorities tried to piece together the events, but some things defy explanation. In the days that followed, life slowly began to return to a semblance of normalcy. Yet the experience left an indelible mark. Our protagonist had faced the darkness and, against all odds, survived. The story would be told and retold, a cautionary tale of courage and resilience. And as the final chapter closed, one thing was clear. The human spirit, though fragile, is remarkably resilient.